This is a Jack Kemp Oral History Project interview with former Senator and presidential nominee Bob Dole. Today is September 17th, 2012. We're at his law offices at Alston and Bird in Washington, D.C., and I'm Morton Kondracki. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning the firm. I love it. It may end up on the cutting floor, but that's a,
So when you think about Jack Kemp, what immediately comes to mind?
just a guy who just seemed to be everywhere. Everybody was his friend. He just kind of over you like a blanket. I don't mean a wet blanket, but he just had tentacles that reached everywhere. He was had an excellent civil rights record. He was, I guess, really the first well-known Republican House member, and there probably were others too, President Ford and others, who had some flexibility. I mean, Jack was for new ideas, and he anything to help somebody in need. Jack was right there, generally spearheading it. So that's how I kind of look at Jack and how I looked at him in '96, to reach out to maybe different groups than Republicans normally do. It didn't work, but it's still the right thing to do.
So you hope that in '96 you hope that Jack would attract African Americans and Latinos, people like that. That's part of why you chose him.
That's probably the primary reason, because he knew everybody, and people said, well, he didn't have any constituency. You couldn't get 5 votes from somewhere because he never lived there. He lived everywhere, California, New York, but we thought it sort of got down to Connie Mack and Jack and a few others. Even Justice Scalia was mentioned. We didn't interview him, but he has some strong supporters.
So what do you think he accomplished in his career?
Well, we used to talk about the Roth-Kemp bill when it was in the Senate, and when it was in the House, it was the Kemp-Roth bill. But to be perfectly clear, it was the Kemp bill. I mean, Bill Roth was a great guy and had thought of some of the things. He'd put in a tax cut, but Jack was sort of he was sort of the pioneer and the advocate and a good friend of Arthur Laffer of supply side fame, very close to President Reagan. So we had a lot of pluses. He did sometimes extend his speaking requirements. I mean, Jack liked to talk, and I remember once in San Diego, our wives were seated behind us because we were going to speak, and Joanne was right behind Jack, and he was just getting warmed up, and it had been quite a while, and she reached over and tugged on his coat. So I thought that only happened in the movies, but he was just a good guy. And I knew at the time that there were a little cabal in the House who weren't Bob Dole fans, because we wanted to cut spending if you're going to do something with taxes. Plus, the older Republicans like me, there's two main things, and that's keeping a balance between spending and taxes, not one exclude the other. You can't get there. Well, you can get there, but it wouldn't be good. And Jack felt the same way, only with more passion than I did. And I kind of regret that, we never were very close friends because he was in the House, I was in the Senate. We never did a lot of socializing, but I'd seen him often enough that even though we may have had some differences, you may have read about him.
I was going to ask you about him.
Yeah.
You were a supply side skeptic.
Right.
Uh,
I just didn't believe you just cut taxes and everything falls in your lap. I mean, I don't think it does yet. I mean, it hadn't been explained to me, but Jack could explain it, and you could say it worked. I mean, Reagan came in 1981, largest tax cut, I think, in history, pretty much across the board. Now, we're supposed to get a reduction in spending with every tax cut, and that's where we failed, because I must say in the Senate, we got a spending cut bill, but there was a little gang, which included Jack in the House, who didn't want to cut any of the programs. And after we sweat blood to get it passed by one vote in the Senate, bringing a guy in from the hospital, Pete Wilson, to make that one vote, Jack wasn't the spearhead. I think he went to their meetings, but Congressman Gingrich at the time and he's very bright. He thought it was a big mistake.
This was on on the spending cuts or on the 82 TEFRA?
TEFRA, they were opposed to TEFRA, and all we did in TEFRA was close one giant loophole called leasing, where these companies make off with $100 million in a tax advantage, incentive, I guess you'd call it. But it didn't make any sense to me, or to Pete Domenici, who I think, is probably largely responsible because he was the budget chairman. And he would say, we can't do this. We finally were able to freeze Social Security for 6 months. That doesn't sound like much, but in this town, even a freeze, not a cut, just freezing it at $8,000 or $800 a month, and it makes a big difference in what we call the out years, years later. And we passed that, and we bruised a lot of feelings. We did pick up 2 Senate seats that cycle and lost 10 House members, so it wasn't that bad. But again, it's Jack. I think Jack was really the originator. He was the prime pusher early on because of his relationship with President Reagan.
So, what did you think about Kemp himself in those days when he was pushing supply side? I mean, here he is, a House member, not a member of Ways and Means.
He's a freelancer.
Yeah. Did you think he was out of his lane, over his head?
No,
No?
might have been over my head, but not over his. I mean, he knew the subject matter, and he could talk at the drop of a hat for, whatever he wanted. And of course, I was with him when he was speaking to big crowds in '96 election, and he would kind of electrify some in the audience. I mean, they really had. If you were a Jack Kemp fan, you're never going to quit, never back off. And Jack, through his own personality, which I think helps a great deal in our line of work, he was a very successful politician in the right sense of the word, with a great family, and but we lost.
Did you pick him partly because he would also excite the conservative base?
That was part of it. I mean, even though I thought I was a conservative, I mean, I voted on all of Jesse Helms' right to life votes. They were not one a day, but they were frequent. But I thought my support of Reagan, I think, was fourth or fifth, which I thought, if he's the top conservative, there are a lot of us follow Reagan because he told me when I was Republican leader for 10 years, and he said if you can't get it all, see if you can get 70%, and we'll get the rest next year. I mean, he wasn't one of these hidebound Republicans who either, my way or the highway. President Reagan wanted to get something done, and he wasn't going to surrender principle or principles just to do it. And he had this knack, which I think Jack had too, of sitting down with the opposite party, with the leaders, committee chairman, just trying to get acquainted. Something I think isn't being done now, but every president has his own style. Jack was kind of a guy who would, if you were seated in a room with some empty chairs next to you, he'd come over and sit down and shoot the breeze. And it didn't take much to turn him on. The Laffer curve and taxes and why it was going to work. And I remember President Reagan, we got the tax cuts, but we never got the spending cuts. And of course in the Senate, we thought that was because Donald Reagan, who was then the chief of staff, blocked our efforts to do this little 6-month freeze, plus some other painful choices. But believe me, you can't get there unless you're willing to make painful choices. And if you don't make painful choices, it's going to be rough for somebody down the line. We keep kicking the can to the next generation. I don't think you and I will be here another 50 years. I'd like to see something done before too long.
Yep. Did you ever talk to Ronald Reagan about Kemp? Do you know what Ronald Reagan thought about Kemp?
No, but I spent a lot of time with Lynn Nofziger, who'd spent a lot of time with Reagan. And Lynn was a disciple. He was always kidding around with sort of negative jokes and stuff, but he thought a lot of Kemp. And in the early Reagan years, he was sort of a semi-permanent fixture in the White House. As the years went on, he kind of, his influence sort of faded. But I did talk to Bob Novak about Kemp, and Bob Novak, a fellow journalist who's now deceased, I remember calling him at the convention. I was still in D.C., and he was in San Diego. And I said, Bob, you're a good friend of Jack Kemp's, aren't you? I want to be sure I got the right response. And he said yes. And I said, what would you think if he were on the ticket? He said, well, I think it'd be a good choice, because they were close friends, but not for that reason. Friendship was part of it, but he thought Jack, again, Bob was a supply sider, and he thought Jack would really excite the middle class. And I did too, but it didn't excite enough.
So how do you think Kemp performed as a vice presidential candidate?
Well, there was some comment about the debate that I didn't. I saw part of it. I invaded somebody's living room somewhere in Illinois. I think we were. But they thought he hadn't been tough enough in defending me or laying out our program. But again, that wasn't Jack's style. I mean, he wasn't one of these people who want to chop the block and take you along with it. I mean, he could be very passionate. I don't recall him ever saying very much personal in a critical way about another colleague. Now again, I didn't work with him on a daily basis, but he was quotable, and he made a speech or said something, it would wind up in print and maybe television. But he had this personality that, he wasn't hard to get acquainted with, and I think he was pretty loyal after he got acquainted. And he was allowed to help, of course, on the Kemp-Roth tax bill. I mean, he spent time in the Senate. He spent time lobbying senators, and I think had influence on a lot of them.
Well, you were the leader then,
Right.
and so he was a help getting the Reagan tax.
Well, he'd worked with people like Bill Armstrong, former Senator Bill Armstrong, who I've always thought is the real conservative. He wasn't as active, but people like that. I mean, Jack knew everybody, not just the conservatives. And he had no quarrel with the, quote, moderates, end quote. I know it's not relevant, but in my state, we had 7 moderates in the state Senate, and 7 were defeated a couple of weeks ago. So they're moving further to the right, and there can't be much more room over there.
Well, I was going to ask you, what do you think Jack Kemp would think about what's going on in the Republican Party nowadays?
If I know Jack, I think he'd be out there trying to calm the waters and make a make a deal in the right sense. In other words, work it out, put a package together, choke a little if you have to support it. So I'd be surprised if Jack were here today if he could appreciate, some of the new members of Congress. It's pretty. We're a conservative party, and I think we've gone about far enough that way.
Right. Just one more question about the '96 campaign. Did you, when you picked him, it surprised a lot of people. You said you picked him because he would outreach to minorities, that he would outreach to the middle class. Did you have any expectation that he would be an attack dog the way vice presidential candidates usually are?
Well, I thought at the time I needed one, so I wasn't the attack dog. I'd played that role long enough. And I think Jack had trouble filling that niche. I mean, everything else was great. He drew good crowds. He gave good speeches. People left, very positive mind about our ticket. But he didn't want to get into a contest, with Gore, for example. But
Scott Reed told me that during the Gore debate, that you were on the phone with Scott again and again and again saying, "When's the quarterback going to go on the attack?" You remember that?
when was what?
When was the quarterback going to go on the attack?
Oh, I probably did. Yeah, we were in this private home listening to TV. But we kept kind of waiting for him to go for the jugular. But, and he did a good job. I think sometimes people's expectations of the attack dog theory is misplaced.
So I heard from somebody that in later years that Mrs. Dole and Joanne sort of got you and Jack to be friends. Is that, does Mrs. Dole and Joanne have a lot in common? And
Yeah, well, they're great friends, and they're very, they're women of great faith, and they probably, when they talked, they probably talked about that their husbands should do this or that. But I don't remember any.
not with you and Jack.
No,
Okay, let me go back to the.
because I don't think I think we were friends anyway. We weren't close friends. We weren't close socially, but we were friends. I knew he was a rising star in the party. So there were so many pluses versus maybe 2 or 3 negatives. It seemed like the right choice.
Let me. So just to go back to supply side, you thought that Kemp and Laffer and those guys thought that all you had to do was cut taxes and the growth would be so big that you wouldn't have to worry about cutting spending, and therefore that was wrong and that the deficits would rise, I take it. That was your basic objection?
Yeah, that was my personal objection, but I was the leader, so it wasn't the Republican Party's position. I just never could figure out how you could stimulate the economy just by cutting taxes. I mean, we're in a bind right now because we have this sequester coming along, and if all those spending cuts, particularly defense, go into effect, it's going to be mayhem around here. Now, Jack would not let that happen. I mean, he was conservative, but I think sometimes he was confused as being a sort of an ultra-right, and he wasn't. You know, he was a very compassionate guy, and because I kind of watched people when I was in the Senate and watch House members too, and the economy was too good. I mean, you can't go out and say, I wish we would have a recession. It would certainly help our ticket. I mean, your campaign would be short-lived. But so you got to have a program. You got to spell it out, which Romney needs to do now. And you've got to give people a reason to vote for you. It's not that you can attack your opponent, not your enemy. They weren't enemies, they were your opponents. And
What did you think about Laffer and Winniski, and did you think they had too much influence on Jack?
I hadn't thought about Winniski. I used to spend a lot of time with him because he was really aggressive on supply side. And they had, again, I'm not privy to it, how Jack would rate all these people, Joanne might, and maybe Trent Lott or someone, or Newt, somebody who worked closely with him. But I think Jack and Lott and Connie Mack, a lot of those members were fairly young at the time. They were conservatives, but they weren't over the top. And so you could be a conservative and still be a Republican. I mean, it's got the point in some places that you almost have to sign an oath or a pledge, not like Grover Norquist pledges, but it's going to have to change.
So, not to dwell excessively on this, but you and Jack sort of traded some barbs from time to time. I mean, you once said that good news was a bus full of supply siders went over a cliff, and the bad news was that 3 seats were empty.
3 empty seats, yeah.
And he said that he accused you of being a Hoover, deep root canal Republican. I just wonder whether, how personal was this in those days?
Well, I think we'd fume and froth at the mouth, and when we first read it or see it on TV or hear it on radio, but I think early on when I was a leader, it used to grate on me quite a bit. But then I understood that it's, fire back if you want to keep it going, but better yet, just let it disappear, change the subject. But again, I never put Jack, with real, I'm not sure you conservatives are the right word. I mean, the inflexible, rigid people in the Congress,
Tea Party.
particularly, our party, and because Reagan came along and then made all of us members of the majority, and I became chairman of the finance committee. I can't even do my own taxes. But we had a lot of good help. I'm just trying to think. I don't think Jack and I in the campaign ever had a bad word. I think we may have suggested after the Gore debate, Scott Reed, I think, was going to tell Jack he had to be a little tougher because we knew we were behind. And you can't win with just a negative campaign, but when you're behind, you have to do something to catch up. So if you're going to play the game, you have to walk the walk. So that's...
Did you think that Jack didn't walk the walk quite?
No, I think I heard Jack speak a couple of times, once in San Diego, and I think he gave the Republican message. He didn't dwell on any one theory on tax cuts, or flat tax, whatever people might be for.
When all is said and done, do you think Reaganomics worked? I mean, the tax cuts and it seemed to produce prosperity. I mean, in the late 70s, you had a 70% top rate and stagflation, and along comes Reagan, and he does what he does. The deficits were big, but prosperity seemed to result. So how did you come out thinking that the Reagan years went?
Well, I thought we had a pretty good combination on revenues and spending, though I must say that we fell behind on the spending reduction side. It's easy to get the tax cuts, but it's much harder to get people to vote to freeze or to cut 1% from any program. So I don't know, it just used to be pretty frustrating because we thought the House under Newt's leadership didn't care a lot for the Senate. In fact, he used to have a favorite term for us, which I can't use here.
Yeah. So you think that's inherent? I mean, is there always sort of distaste between the House and the Senate? Sometimes I think it's worse than the distaste between Republicans and Democrats.
Well, the House members used to ask me, said, you know, we've got a lot of bright guys in the House, but they're never on television. You got to be a senator, even though you may not know anything. You're introduced as a senator, and we're seeing now some of these bright new House members who have good programs. They have some flexibility. They're realistic. But I think there were times when, you know, I used to say Richard Nixon couldn't be nominated in today's party because he was another moderate, I guess, if you use terms. But you know, the Republicans who didn't like me a couple of weeks ago invited me to come out and raise money the 28th of September. So things fly right by, you know. you're hot today and cold tomorrow.
What about the '86 tax reform? There was Bradley Gephardt, and there was Kemp Caston, and there was a Reagan plan, and then Bob Packwood's plan finally passed. How much credit do you think Kemp deserves for that '86 reform?
Well, what I remember best was Packwood, his performance on the Senate floor when he go down into the well and walk back and forth. Didn't have any notes, didn't need any. And I don't know whether Jack, he surely had some influence because he was the tax man on the House side when anybody had a tax issue. They'd consult, I'm sure they'd consult with Kemp most every time because he was looked up to as the go-to guy on taxes, and deservedly so. I mean, he believed it, and he preached it, and he traveled all over the country, served on boards when it was legal, and I don't know. We gave it our best shot. We didn't do it as well as we should have, but we carried, 19 states? Something like that.
You know, you in the '96 campaign, you actually advocated a 15% across the board tax cut. So, did you become a kind of a supply sider, do you think?
Oh, the polls didn't reflect it. So, and I'm always wondering when people say, well, or somebody says on television that so-and-so is a supply sider, how many people out in the audience even have any idea what he's talking about or she's talking about? And I think that's one shortcoming that we have with the interviewee and the interviewer. Because a lot of these things that we deal with them every day, but some people, when they hear it for the first time, don't have the foggiest notion. Now, if Jack were making a speech, they wouldn't have any foggy notion because he would lay it out and lay it out again if he thought the message hadn't gotten through.
Tell them again and again and again sometimes. Right?
Yeah, well, that's the old story. If you didn't get it the first time, we'll give it to you 8th, 9th, and 10th time.
So what's your most vivid memory of Jack Kemp?
Well, trying to find him was one hard. I think at the time I made up my mind, and we'd called Jack, and he and Joanne were off somewhere. And I had Rodney Arment and Sheila Burke. They were my two bird dogs. But they finally located Jack and Joanne somewhere, like West Virginia, I'm not certain. And then they came to Russell. And I asked Jack, I said, Jack, I've announced that I'd like to have you as my running mate. And he said, did you think of it carefully? I said, yeah, we spent weeks interviewing people and not trying to make a spectacle of it, parading people in and out of your office. And we know we're behind. We know that there's some who don't believe I'm conservative enough. And so we have to stiffen up our conservative base. And so he decided there in Russell, Kansas, I think he had already decided, but he wanted to be sure that I was sincere and that I knew what I was doing and that I knew his primary goal was to reduce taxes and this combination to get more growth.
So he was checking with you to see whether you were dedicated to his program before he was going to take the job?
No, I just say that in picking Jack, that's one of the things that I felt certain would be helpful. He never raised it, but
So, did you call him somewhere to offer him the vice presidency, or did Scott or somebody else?
oh no, I called him. Scott may have too, because they're very, very close. But I know Sheila and Rod tracked him down somewhere, and they all flew out to Kansas. But in my own thinking, I thought, well, this may help me a few points because nobody is quarreling about Jack's credentials, conservative. But there are some who believe that I'm not conservative enough.
You said this to him?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, he knew it anyway. He may have felt the same way. But I think, as I said earlier, I think I was not as high a supporter of Reagan than Jesse Helms, but I think I ranked fourth or fifth. So that was conservative enough. And we got a lot done. But Jack, I think, because we hadn't had this day-to-day getting acquainted, talking about the bills and talking about, his family and his wife and himself. But Jack would give great introductions. Made me feel like giving a good speech.
So is that sort of Russell unveiling kind of your most vivid memory of Kemp? I mean, he was hidden away in a motel room somewhere.
Yeah.
Um,
Press was trying to find him, but
didn't leak, did it? Before he was announced?
I always thought maybe I'd call Novak before we made a decision. And there might just be a slight chance that Bob kind of trickled it out there. It wasn't surprise factor because I doubt that makes that much difference. But what you don't want to do is to make up your mind and then call a person when they decline. That's one thing I learned from Nixon. Don't call somebody unless you know the answer. So I didn't call anybody. Well, not really.
But you knew that Kemp would accept because Reed and John Buckley had talked to him, right?
Yeah.
So then you called him in West Virginia.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the state, but
Remember anything about the conversation?
Well, I think it was pretty matter of fact that, that it's getting time for the convention, and I thought we should have announced early because we were grasping for straws on how we can pick up some more states. And there were quite a few in play that we lost by a fairly close margin. And that's where I thought Jack would, kind of a utility guy. I mean, I don't think he ever had an enemy. He's always full of pep and full of vigor and patting you on the back, and he's strong. That kind of gird yourself so you don't fall. So, and I think he did do that in some states. I've never gone back to check. And he's been, when Elizabeth had her little run, Jack went down to speak for her, gave her money, did anything she wanted. So I ended up knowing Jack a lot better than I did going in, and it was a plus.
This was in later years then?
Right.
When Mrs. Dole was running for the Senate and re-elected, was he around for her re-elect too?
Jack?
Yeah.
I don't think so. I don't think he could run for re-election unless he's stepped out. Did he drop out of term?
Well, he died in 2009. When did she run for re-election? I forget.
When was it?
2008.
Yeah,
Yeah.
So how would you rank Jack Kemp as a 20th century political figure? We'll come to the end here, and is there anything that I haven't asked you about him that you remember that you'd like to have on the record?
Well, if Jack were around now, I know it's too bad you lose people like Jack and your own personal story. But the thing about Jack is, when we lost, he wasn't depressed or anything. He'd sort of, politics hadn't been very good to him, and his poll numbers and so were not as strong as they had been. But once he got in the race, his numbers picked up again. It's only when they put us together that we lost. So, and he had a big asset in Joanne too. He's a wonderful person, and she traveled with us quite often and keep us on time. Both Jack and I we weren't like Clinton, but we were late sometimes.
Right. It was going to be pretty hard for you guys to win in '96 anyway. You had peace and prosperity,
Yeah, I've got this 7-page handwritten letter from Nixon, which I got before the election. And he went down the list. Said the age is not a problem. You still have a strong voice. But the one, number 7, was if the economy is good, you can't win. And he was right. I mean, why would anybody want to throw Clinton out if they had a job and their family was doing pretty well? So we've teamed up with him on a few things. I don't think Jack. I'm trying to think of an occasion where Jack was all over the opposition. I mean, he was sort of in a neutral zone part of the time. He knew that if he made it partisan, we didn't have the horses to get it passed. So that's just the way it is. And he also knew that it'd be nice to get 100%, that maybe you would only get 70 or 80. Take it. Take it. Because you remember in the 81 tax bill, there were a lot of places where we went too far, particularly with children and middle income people. And Reagan was perfectly willing that we close the loopholes and fix it.
Well, Jack was against the fixes.
I
I mean, and he, as I understand it, the economy tipped into a recession because Volcker crunched down on money supply. And my reading of what Kemp thought was that any tax cuts in a recession were a bad idea. And so he was against Reagan, and Reagan called him into the Oval Office and worked him over, and he said, "Mr. President, I'll never be against you, but I'm going to be against this." So he was pretty rigid on
Yeah.
the tax cut issue.
Oh. I think in 20 years, if you're interviewing somebody and ask about 20 years ago, there was a member of Congress whose primary goal was to reduce taxes. You'd probably find some people who could name that person, particularly in the activists.
Jack Kemp would be one of them. Well, Senator Dole, do you have any other final thoughts about Jack?
No, there are always the people afterwards looking for scapegoats. And I had people call me to say what a terrible job Jack did in the debate. That he didn't defend me enough. But it wasn't any personal reason. That was his style. But we had him on our list from day one. Of course, he'd worked for Reed, for Scott, and Scott had good things to say about him. And I thought Scott was pretty bright politically.
Looking back, are you glad you did that, or would you think Connie Mack or John Engler or Carol Campbell would have been better?
Well, I thought a lot about Connie Mack, and because he was from Philly and his heritage and Catholic, conservative, nobody would doubt his credentials. He was he's either going to be Kemp or Mack. And there are probably a lot of good ones out there. but could have called Cheney or put him in head of the search committee. He probably would come up with a good name.
Would have been Cheney.
I'll say one thing, he has a bright daughter. Really seems to be in defense matters particularly.
Right.
Let's see, I'm trying to, I don't,
Was there anybody else you consulted about besides Novak and your own staff about whether to pick Kemp?
a couple of friends of mine in Kansas who knew about Jack Kemp because they'd been back here a lot. One was a very successful banker who unfortunately passed away, and the other was a fellow named Dave Owens, who a longtime friend, and got in trouble with fundraising and had this. He was bundling. He was collecting from the employees so it could be a big donation, and a lot of it was being done, but Dave had to serve a little time, so it's tough. Do you ever think we'd be spending this much money on politics?
Nope.
I wonder where Fred Wertheimer is. Is he still around, isn't
Yeah,
he?
he's still around. He's
Yeah.
mad about it.
Oh, he must be.
Citizens United.
Yeah, he must be livid.
Yeah.
Well, let's
so what
see.
let me ask you one other thing. So what about Paul Ryan? I mean, Paul Ryan was a worked for Jack. How do you feel about Paul Ryan as a?
I think that was a plus for him, the fact that he had worked for Jack, and very proud of it, and mentions it frequently. So Jack's legacy could continue here if they elect the R&R ticket. And that's, that speaks well of Jack. I mean, Ryan doesn't have to say anything, except that he was on I Work for Kemp, and that's it. But he was proud of it, properly so, and letting people know about it. I mean, Jack could really miss this campaign. I mean, he's like some of the rest of us. They ring the bell, we're in the ring.
Right. Senator Dole, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.